Okay, so our last speaker, this session is my coworker and colleague, Dr. Stephen Pearson, New York State DEC's Invasive Species Coordination Section. Steve's work focuses on determining abundance, distribution, early detection strategies, and techniques, including eDNA and management of established populations of AIS. Today, Steve will talk about a persistent seed bank, the case for annual water chestnut monitoring once a population is presumed eradicated.
Thank you, Kathy. So I will talk today about water chestnut seeds and making the case for continued monitoring for the long term after populations have been managed to the point where we're no longer finding water chestnut for several years. So as Stuart went over, water chestnut is a annual plant. It's rooted, floating plant, and typically you'll see it, you'll find it with these rosettes that are popping up above the water. And those rosettes are formed around a central stem, and they float due to this inflated petiole, which you can see in the photo here. Typically, water chestnut will breach the surface in late May to mid-June, depending on where you are across its introduced range here in the Northeast. And you will, your management of it will depend on how quickly it breaches the surface and how quickly the seeds mature. In terms of fecundity, each individual plant can produce up to 20 seeds on that plant. So if those seeds are allowed to mature and drop into and become members of the seed bank, then you've lost that opportunity to remove those individuals from future years. So typically, you'll also find a lot of floating seeds or seeds along the banks. Those are no longer viable, and those are present, and they can cause problems because each seed has these sharp points on it, and that's what you can see in this photo here. You can see some of these sharp points, and if you step on them or your dog steps on them, they can cause problems. So that's one issue with water chestnut. Typically, the seeds mature by late July, and they can mature earlier in other regions. And so, as mentioned before, that's dependent on where you are and what the weather in the spring and early summer have been. It's important to note that seed longevity can last up to 12 years. So if seeds become members of the seed bank, then you'll be potentially managing and looking for those seeds for the next 12 years. In terms of water chestnut ecology, we heard great information about that from a previous presenter. We know that it grows up to 5 meters depth, but prefers slightly shallower water from 0.3 to 2 meters. It forms these dense monocultures with up to 50 rosettes per meter squared. So that can alter the aquatic plant community by shading the understory. So you might lose the understory plants, so your submerged aquatics, as well as any other emergent aquatics that you would see. And they can also alter the plant and animal communities and the animal communities. And as Stuart pointed out, it depends on what you're interested in, whether or not you can see the changes in the animal community or the fish community as positive or negative. And it can outcompete these floating plants. In New York, well, nationwide, water chestnut was first introduced in Massachusetts in the Cambridge Botanical Gardens in 1877. By 1884, it was present in New York with the first report at Collins Lake. And the introduction is due to unknown causes, but likely either from water garden escapee or through waterfowl. The map here shows Schenectady County, which is where Collins Lake is. And this aerial photograph shows Collins Lake in the present day. So there's still water chestnut present at Collins Lake in 2020. The water chestnut is regulated in New York State under Part 575, which prohibits the possession and transport of water chestnut in New York. So as far as the spread and distribution, we can go through that here. You see in 1884, it was only in this one location in one county in New York. By 1950, it had moved further down the Mohawk River to the confluence of the Hudson River and had moved downstream and as well as upstream. And as Stuart pointed out, water chestnut had been in the Hudson River for 100 years likely or more. And so these early reports between 1880 and 1950 are lacking in detail, but this is what we have. By 1975, Lake Champlain and the rest of the Hudson River Valley moving upstream had been invaded, as well as a few of the counties in the Finger Lakes region and southern Lake Ontario. By 2000, additional counties and more of the Hudson River were showing water chestnut populations present, and by 2020, in this past summer, water chestnut's known from most counties in New York. At the county scale, this looks pretty bad, but at the individual scale, you can see there's still plenty of areas of the state that without reported water chestnut. However, this IMAP invasives map does show that water chestnut has been reported quite broadly across the Hudson River Valley, the Catskills, Lake Ontario, the Finger Lakes, a few in western New York, and moving up into the Adirondacks as well as Long Island. All that information looks pretty bad. Between 1884 and 2000, we had about 230 populations known and growing. But since then, the number of known populations has increased to roughly 1,800 populations. This increase between 2000 and 2020 is likely a true increase in the distribution of water chestnut across New York, but it's also likely due to improved record keeping and reporting. And much of that has come through the establishment of IMAP invasives and the mapping challenges that they've been supporting over the last few years, as well as the establishment of PRISM networks across the region and the focus on aquatic invasive species across the state of New York. In 2020 and currently, we're trying to better understand the problem and taking three approaches for that. One is using IMAP invasives to track reports and use these mapping challenges to better understand this distribution, where they are and what different management strategies are being followed. The portals that IMAP is developing have both a public as well as a manager-specific portal. And so look for that. This is a draft picture of it on the top right. And look for that in the coming year to come out to assist managers across New York and then also across the region for detailed information on what's working in terms of management. In the Hudson and Mohawk rivers, there are mapping efforts going on, and the map right here kind of shows a 2020 survey. And these orange beds that are depicted here, these are invasive beds, and in most cases, they're water chestnut beds within the Mohawk River. And across the state, working regionally, we have the PRISMs, which are working to engage all the different stakeholders and look for solutions to water chestnut issues at the local scale. There are different management strategies for water chestnut. And in most cases, people are using manual removals, and they're typically small-scale removals that can work when repeated to reduce the abundance of water chestnut They're also used to follow up to mechanical removals after harvesting has occurred and populations have been reduced greatly. There's chemical applications, which are not broadly used across the region, but there are some examples. And the photo here is of a chemical application within the Finger Lakes region of New York. And finally, we have mechanical harvesting, which is being used for large infestations. And after several years of harvesting, you can greatly reduce the amount of water chestnut and bring it to a point where you no longer need a harvester, but can follow with hand manual pulls. So here I have two examples of how harvesting can be followed up with manual pulls to greatly reduce the water chestnut abundance in there. The first on the left is from Lake Champlain, and it's a figure here from the Lake Champlain Basin Atlas, which shows that between 1999 and 2014, the amount of water, or the area of water chestnut that was being mechanically harvested has been greatly reduced. In 1999, you can see that about the southern third of Lake Champlain had a high abundance of water chestnut and required the use of mechanical harvest. Over the 15 years between then and 2014, mechanical harvesting had reduced the amount of water chestnut that needed to be mechanically harvested to just the southern tip. And that is the current state of water chestnut in Lake Champlain today. The figure on the right here shows Massapequa Reservoir, which is on Long Island. And the photos are pre and post harvest from 2018. And you can see that water chestnut had significant coverage of this lake in 2018. This was the fourth year of mechanical harvesting in this reservoir. And what this figure shows is that after 4 years of mechanical harvesting, removing more and more material each year, more and more biomass, the following 2 years were able to be controlled with manual pulls rather than mechanical harvesting. So with a concerted effort of dense populations and mechanical harvesting when possible, you can reduce the amount of water chestnut to a manageable amount through manual pulls. So as far as providing information here on continued control after you've reached that point where water chestnut populations are very low or even potentially eradicated, I have a few case studies. Two are from very small ongoing control projects, and then I have three kind of cautionary tales that we'll talk about. They're mostly in Eastern New York, so, two from Long Island, two from the Capital Region, and one from the Adirondack region. First, we'll talk about Mill Pond at Oyster Bay National Wildlife Refuge. This is a fairly small pond, 7 acres, and you can see that water chestnut by 2008 had become a fairly large problem here. In between 2008 and 2011, hand pulls were performed, and quite a bit of effort went into removing much of that material. And in the years since 2011, so 2012 to 2020, the amount of effort that's gone into control water chestnut has been greatly reduced. It typically has been 2 people for about half a day paddling the lake and removing water chestnut since that. And there's been some fluctuations. They haven't been able to completely eradicate the seed bank, but they've kicked it back quite a bit. And you can see there are some ebb and flow here with the amount of water chestnut that they're pulling each year, but it's a relatively small amount. And with continued effort like this, they should be able to completely remove water chestnut from this system in the coming years. Next, there's the Lincoln Pond at Hike Preserve. This is a local waterway to where I live and a place that I recreate from time to time. And you can see from the figure that the water chestnut was discovered in 2018. They had roughly 90 plants, 80 to 100 plants is what was reported in that year. It had likely been present for a year or two before that. But in 2018, after discovery, they pulled it, followed up in 2019 and 2020 with continued pull. And you can see that there's this reduction in the number of plants that they're pulling. Once again, with continued effort here, they should be able to eradicate water chestnut in this water body. Loon Lake is a lake in the Adirondacks. It's quite large, 581 acres. It has quite a bit of habitat available for water chestnut. It does have a lake association, and annual surveys are performed at this lake. In 2015, a small population of water chestnut was discovered in this northern bay here, shown in the top of the figure. And all of the plants found were removed. The follow-up survey in 2016 found no water chestnut. However, in 2017, again, they did find a handful of plants which were then removed. Annual surveys since then have not found any plants, and it may be that the seed bank has been depleted in Loon Lake. However, it's important that they continue these surveys over the next several years to determine, well, to remove any plants that may sprout from any water chestnut remaining in the seed bank. Swan Pond, this is another example from Long Island. It's a 57-acre pond. Water chestnut was discovered there in 2009 and managed between 2009 and 2015. The only great records on number of plants removed are from the first 2 years, 2009 and 2010. Both years they removed 120 plants. And continued efforts with decreased number of plants between 2011 and 2015. By 2016, the water chestnut were no longer being found, and they were not found in Okay, thank you. Between 2016 and 2018. In 2019, no survey was performed, and a survey in 2020 found over 400 water chestnut plants had rebounded, and the population was larger than it had been at any other point in the water chestnut history of this lake. So skipping this 1 year, 2019, likely meant that water chestnut seeds emerged, reproduced, and dropped. Multiple plants must have reproduced that year and dropped multiple seeds. So you'll have this quick rebound to greater than 400 plants. And if not noticed in 2020, that would grow exponentially onward. So this site is definitely a cautionary tale as to why it's important for that continued survey year after year. Lake Taconic, this is another interesting story. And in the 2004, water chestnut was discovered, and it was managed by the state parks in 2004 and 2005. That followed with 3 years of follow-up surveys, however, in which no water chestnut were found. In the years between 2009 and 2019, no surveys were performed. However, there's a vague report from 2011 of water chestnut having been found. However, a follow-up survey didn't find any water chestnut, and that was left to case. Dan Weber and I were out there this summer doing a vegetation survey, and we discovered water chestnut back in, I believe it was early June. And within a few weeks, state parks, the DC, and the Capital Mohawk Region PRISM all got out there and removed all those plants. And now it's going to be controlled and surveyed for in the coming years. By 2020, it had likely been there for several years, as water chestnut was found in a decent bed in this region of the bay, but also scattered across the other areas of the easternmost region of the lake. So in conclusion, on a local scale, water chestnut can be managed, and in some locations it can even be eradicated. It's important that long-term monitoring is part of the management and the effort at any lake where populations are thought to have been eradicated, because that population reemergence can happen rapidly. So annual surveys and control are important, and that should occur before the seeds mature. So even though you think you're not going to find water chestnut, you should still survey these types of systems in the earlier part of the summer, so that in the event that water chestnut is found, it can be controlled before those seeds set and become part of the seed bank again. And importantly, you can't really skip a year or two of surveying, because that population reemergence can happen quite rapidly within a few year period. So thank you for your time, and if I have any questions, I can take them now. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.